question, of course, becomes, well, how do you know your Christianity is any different and not just another version of the other Christianities? And then we're into some really interesting stuff, baby. Woo! Hey everybody, Mike here. Welcome to the Vox Podcast. So glad that you are tuning in. Welcome to the show. I am here with my lovely and talented producer, Tim. Tim, say hello.
Hello, Vox.
We've had a very big couple of weeks in the Vox Podcast. Number one, I discovered that Tim has a Pearl Jam tattoo on his leg of the Stickman from the early 90s.
It's important discoveries.
It is. Just when I thought you couldn't be cooler.
I blow your mind.
The second thing that happened, of course, was that Jesus rose from the dead. And obviously not within the last 2 weeks, but we celebrated the event within the last couple of weeks. And then
these are not in order of importance.
Well, and I was going to say the third one is that we both seen Avengers Endgame, and
yes,
Thanos does not rise from the dead. Let's just
spoilers.
Put it that way. So anyway, and I love my son Nate, and I love the Marvel movies, and we talk, they spur a lot of discussion in our house. Tim has been a comic book guy how old were you when you started getting into it?
As long as I can remember. My very first toy or stuffed animal that was purchased for me prior to my coming out into this world, being born, I guess is the correct way to say that, was a Spider-Man doll. So and I still have it. That's my oldest toy. So Spider-Man and me go back as far as I can remember.
Wow. Okay. One of my first that I remember, and here's our age difference, was the original set of Star Wars figures. Oof, you had to send in a form, and that they would be mailed to you. I mean, I will never forget getting them in the mail. And
special.
Yeah, and had I known they'd be worth $500 million, later, I would have just kept them in those boxes, but
yeah,
who knows?
I have them not
they
in
look
those
too
boxes,
fun.
In a plastic bag that my kids play with.
So Tim, today we need to correct some misinformation on the internet, not about Pearl Jam, not about Endgame, but rather about the resurrection. And so I want us to hearken a week or so back to that Easter Sunday morning. And, we had gone to church on Saturday because it's Sunday in Israel is the way I look at it. So we went to Easter Saturday church, and I got up and I was browsing Twitter, enjoying the many statements of resurrection. He is risen, and tomb was empty. And then I come across a tweet that I got to be honest, man. I got to be honest. It disturbed the resurrection vibe I had going that day, because it was a link. So it was from the president of Union Seminary. Okay, her name is Serene Jones, which is really one of the coolest names I've ever heard. Let's just start there.
Cool name.
And she's a serious theologian, obviously the head of a seminary. And in it, she'd said, hey, you can believe in resurrection without believing that Jesus rose from the dead. All right. And then it linked to an article in the New York Times that it was an interview with her about resurrection and Easter and Christianity and so on. And so my resurrection vibe was disrupted by this said tweet because it raised a much. I've been eager to have this conversation, and it raised a big question for me about when is theological gatekeeping appropriate? When's it necessary? When's it needed? When when do you go against not ever a person, but against a view pretty hard? You know what I mean? And for some reason, I found myself fired up on Easter Sunday morning about this tweet that was innocuous enough in terms of, I wasn't offending anybody specifically, but it was just, hey, you can believe in resurrection without the resurrection of Jesus. And then it linked to this article, and I want to, if it's all right with you, Tim, I want to quote a big part of this article, because it's a back and forth between Serene Jones and then Nicholas Kristof, who has done a series of interviews like with Tim Keller and other famous sort of religious figures.
That's a good name, too.
And what, Tim Keller or Nicholas Kristof?
Well, Tim Keller. Tims are always great, but Nicholas Kristof.
Well, Nicholas Kristof.
Sounds like a name from Frozen.
No, what it is, bro, is it's from Left Behind, and it is clearly the name of the Antichrist. And so if you go back and read the Left Behind books, which, as I hear, are, word by word accounts from Revelation directly, you find out that Nicholas Kristof, it's because what's Kristof? Christ off. See, I mean, it's proven. So
the creativity is off the charts.
So
enough to bring Nicolas Cage in. Didn't he make the movie? I mean, after
after
Holier
Kirk
Than
Cameron.
Thou Art, who's our patron saint actor? Oh, Kirk Cameron. Mike Seaver.
Yes, he was very dreamy. But I digress, because Tim, Easter Sunday, the world breathlessly waited for my tweeted reaction to this interview. So I tweeted an Easter Sunday tweet. I tweeted, and in my indignation, I said something like, I don't know. I don't even remember what I said. Who cares? But her article raised a bunch of points I want to talk about. But the bigger point I want to talk about is, when is gatekeeping okay? Because when I tweeted my tweet out, which the world was breathlessly awaiting, I got a tweet back that said, okay, great, but aren't you the dude that snickers at the theological dogmatic folks, in interviews with Bonnie and Rob Bell? So where's the line? And I thought, ooh, how dare someone call me out on any double standards that I may have? But I thought that was a great question worthy of discussion. Okay, so if it's all right with you, I'm going to, with that context in the Twitter sphere, I want to read her interview, and I just want to offer comments and see what you think, and because I think there's some stuff here that's super interesting to talk about. But the bigger point isn't just her view. It's when is it okay to get fired up? And I don't mean angry, but I just mean like when do we really go after something? If we're not going to sit and fight over, was creation 6 days long, 6,000 years ago, even though some want to go to the wall on that. What do we go to the wall on, and when is that appropriate? So this was obviously when I was like, oh, this seems fairly central. So Kristof says, first off, you see what I did there? Happy Easter, Reverend Jones. To start, do you think of Easter as a literal flesh and blood resurrection? He says, have problems with that. Again, Christ off. There you go. She, Serene Jones, responds, when you look at the Gospels, the stories are all over the place. That's true. There's no resurrection story in Mark, just an empty tomb. Well, that's true. Those who claim to know whether or not it happened are kidding themselves. That's true, except that the other three Gospels are pretty clear in saying, no, it wasn't just an empty tomb. It was resurrection appearances also. So I agree that, if I'm sitting here proffering opinions on whether or not the resurrection happened apart from the eyewitness testimony, at least of the appearances of Jesus, yes, what's the point of that? But it does seem like, well, you do have some folks who said they saw the Jesus that had supposedly died, and the tomb was now empty. So you have Jesus died, and the Romans were good at crucifixion. He was buried, and the tomb was empty, and then you have him appearing again. That's the 3-step sequence that the Gospels portray. So I would disagree with her a little bit. She says, but the empty tomb symbolizes that the ultimate love in our lives cannot be crucified and killed. And I got to be honest, Tim, and I hope this is charitable, but I have no flippant idea what that means. I mean, is that kind of like saying it's an archetypical story and good wins over evil. And, I really don't get how you get Jesus he died at the hands of terrorists, and it was awful, and he was, abandoned. And then his disciples said he had risen, but actually what it's showing us is that love triumphs over all. I mean, I don't know how we get that from that. I mean, I'm not, I'm not sure just how that would work exactly. So the empty tomb symbolizes that the ultimate love in our lives cannot be crucified or killed. Okay. But that's obviously not the claim that the gospel writers are making. And I don't even know theoretically how you kind of get to that one. But she continues. And I'm trying to, again, we always want to be so charitable and give the benefit of the doubt. And so I'm trying to be playful. But I do think this conversation deeply matters. What was that? Was that your phone? What was that?
It was a baseball update.
Oh, well, okay. Then hey, don't you dare edit that out, because it totally sounded like you just ripped one on the podcast.
We have very sensitive theological conversations get me gassy.
Now she continues. For me, it's impossible to tell the story of Easter without also telling the story of the cross. And amen to that. The crucifixion is a first century lynching. I wouldn't use that. Again, not that anyone's caring or asking, but lynching, there's a racial thing behind that. And there's certainly from the Jews and Gentiles, there was racial animosity, but man, crucifixion was an act of terror. I mean, that's beheading of Christians, right? What ISIS does. I mean, this is I think this is, if there is such a thing more brutal than lynching, we're looking at it. So the crucifixion is a first century lynching. It couldn't be more pertinent to our world today. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Hurrah. But Nicholas kind of, picks up on the fact that isn't kind of the normal belief. And he says, but without a physical resurrection, isn't there a risk that we are left with just the crucifixion? Right? So how can we say that love actually triumphs over everything if the crucifixion is the only reality, the only historical event that we trust in that whole narrative? So here's what she says. And again, I'm not questioning her as a person. I'm sure she would answer this much deeply if we were interviewing her. I get all of that. But she says crucifixion is not something that God is orchestrating from upstairs. And again, that's interesting, because that's kind of exactly what the apostles preach in the book of Acts, that God did orchestrate this with the help of evil men. And that doesn't absolve anybody of anything. It's just that God did orchestrate a bit of this. And what she means by orchestrate, she clarifies. She says the pervasive idea of an abusive godfather who sends his own kid to the cross so God could forgive people is nuts. For me, the cross is an enactment of human hatred.
Jeez Louise.
You got to keep it, buddy. So random.
I don't know why now this is a thing when it hasn't been before.
What baseball alert are we getting? Do you want to share it with our audience?
It's MLB, whatever the MLB app is.
And it's just giving you scores?
I don't know, because it just says that it's happening, but
okay.
Yeah, well, probably scores or something that's happening.
Okay.
Something that's of utmost importance.
They make a notifications button on the iPhone that you can turn that off. I'm just throwing that out there.
I'm going to do it right now.
No. You don't have to do it. I'm just.
We don't want any more gassy interruptions.
So good. So she says, the pervasive idea of an abusive godfather who sends his own kid to the cross so God could forgive people is nuts. For me, the cross is an enactment of our human hatred. But what happens on Easter is the triumph of love in the midst of suffering. Isn't that reason for hope? Now, again, lots to agree with and lots to disagree with. The pervasive idea of an abusive godfather who sends his kid to the cross. We've talked a lot about that. And yes, I think that picture of what was happening within the Trinity on the cross is absolutely incorrect. And I think it is a harmful picture that God is some angry parent, and the son steps forward and says, if you have to hit somebody, hit me. And so I totally agree. I totally agree with that sentiment. And I agree that the cross is the enactment of the worst of humanity. She words it as human hatred, of course, but that is the greatest that evil can do, is to torture, humiliate, and ultimately murder someone. That's the biggest triumph of evil right there over an individual person. And she then says, but what happens on Easter is the triumph of love in the midst of suffering. Isn't that reason for hope? Now, again, in what way does love triumph if the resurrection story isn't true? I guess it just becomes a metaphor of good winning over evil. But what exactly then gives us reason that that's true? If you were to take a purely evolutionary view and materialistic view of the world, what reason do you have in proclaiming that good will win? I don't, I'm just not sure where that idea is generated within a Christian story that doesn't have like the conquering of death and a physical sort of resurrection. Now, I'm sure she would have lots of thoughts on this. So again, because it's so abbreviated, it's easy to pick out little bits and pieces. Nicholas responds, and Tim, make sure I'm moving through this quickly enough, but not too quick, because the only thing more boring.
Following.
Okay, all right. He then picks up on the child abuse theme, and he says, well, how do we reconcile an omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing God? How do we reconcile that God with evil and suffering? And she says, at the heart of faith is a mystery. God is beyond our knowing, not a being or an essence or an object. And I don't know what that means. In other words, of course, mystery is at the heart of faith, no question. But God is not beyond our knowing insofar as God has revealed God's self to us. And so if Jesus, the claim of the New Testament is that Jesus is the definitive and ultimate revelation of God's true essence. So agreed, in a vacuum, God is beyond our knowing. But it seems like it's the claim of the Jesus writers, and if you trust them, the claim of Jesus himself, that he is revealing the Father in a way that we can know the Father. So when she says God is not a being, I don't know. I kind of go, well, I don't know. I think God seems to desire relationship and personhood and personality and all those sorts of attributes. I don't know. I would probably say God is a being, but I don't know what she means. She says, but I don't worship an all-powerful, all-controlling, omnipotent, omniscient being. This is a fabrication of Roman theory and Greek mythology. That is not the God of Easter. The God of Easter is vulnerable and is connected to the world in profound ways that don't involve manipulating the world, but constantly inviting us into love, justice, and mercy. And again, I don't... The historical construal of God as all-powerful and all-controlling, I disagree with too. Absolutely. God is not the author of evil. And so I don't believe he sits and controls the damage we do to each other. No question about that. And I do believe the God of Easter is vulnerable and connected to the world. Absolutely true. So okay. But then Nicholas, and he's asking a natural progression of questions. Well, isn't Christianity without a physical erection of... Jeez. Oh, my Lord. Oh, this is what happens when we record late. Good night. Oh, okay. Let me rephrase. Oh.
This is Vox off the cuff. Vox on the raw. Not Vox in the buff.
Vox on the rocks.
Off the cuff. Vox on the rocks.
For me, okay, so isn't a Christianity without a physical resurrection less powerful and awesome? When the message is about love, that's less religion and more philosophy. Now, again, she responds, for me, the message of Easter is that love is stronger than life or death. So evidently, the way that Jesus was raised in her understanding, and again, I'm projecting onto her, is that the disciples loved, their love for Jesus transformed them into people who, were engaging in love and justice and mercy in a way that transformed the ancient world and kind of brought the spirit of Jesus forward in our imaginations through, their willingness to sacrifice and to serve and love.
So the idea then would be that Jesus' death inspired the apostles and the people going forward, not his resurrection.
Well, no, I think, and again, I don't know what she would say, but what I've heard theologians from this sort of camp say is that Jesus, and they would never say it like this, but Jesus is kind of resurrected in our hearts, right? When we're at a funeral and you say, well, they'll live forever in me, and you're like, oh, okay. So there was a collective awareness or consciousness of Jesus, or his death validated his message in the sense that it is far better to die at the hands of your enemies than to kill your enemies with your hands, right? I mean, so it was something. So he's either a moral exemplar, or it's a story about how our affection for Jesus kept Jesus alive in the earth. Something. I mean, something along those lines. No, but listen to what she says after this. She says, the message of Easter is that love is stronger than life or death. And cool, I love that. And she says, that's a much more awesome claim than they put Jesus in the tomb and 3 days later he wasn't there. Oh, now this is juicy. So what she's saying is, okay, listen, the Easter is actually less epic if you're saying, hey, they put him in a tomb and 3 days later he was there, or he wasn't there. Got it. What's more epic, according to her, is that love is stronger than life or death. Okay, cool. But the claim of the first Christians wasn't that they put him in a tomb and he wasn't there. It was, they put him in a tomb, we went to look for him, he wasn't there, and oh, we've seen him. And it's not just that we saw him in some hallucination sense. It's that we touched him. He was flesh and blood. He was new humanity. He was fully dead and buried. And yet he's now new in some still physical way. I mean, it's like, if that claim's true, then that claim is way more awesome than just love is stronger than life or death, right? If it's true that death has been defeated, you can actually experience forgiveness, reconciliation, renewal, healing, all of those sorts of things here and now, and that death no longer has to dominate our thinking, and the depression and divorce and all those things don't have the last word. I mean, that seems to be a bit more epic of a claim. So the claim of Easter isn't that he was in a tomb, he wasn't there. No. It was, he was in a tomb, he wasn't there because he had risen from the dead and conquered death and inaugurated the beginnings of a new creation that God had been promising the whole time. Then she says, and this is where it gets so good. She says, for Christians for whom the physical resurrection becomes a sort of obsession, that seems to me to be a pretty wobbly faith. What if tomorrow someone found the body of Jesus still in the tomb? Would that mean that Christianity was a lie? No, faith is stronger than that. And I see it the exact opposite way. This is so great that she says this, because to me, the whole thing rests on the historical claim that there was a real person named Jesus, that Jesus did stuff in the world and taught stuff in the world, was crucified on a Roman cross, was found not to be wrapped in linens in a tomb, but found to be teaching and ministering and doing miracles and doing the stuff he was doing before his death, now after his death, to his closest followers. And oh my goodness, if that's what she wants to call a wobbly faith, then absolutely. If you could definitively show that these are the bones of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, I would absolutely abandon Christianity immediately. Absolutely. I would still believe in God. I have independent reasons to believe in God, but so much for Jesus, man. I mean, like that to me is a bit mind-blowing, because if Christianity were philosophy that says that love is stronger than life or death, well then yeah, of course it doesn't depend on the historical resurrection. And even for those of us for whom the resurrection isn't some obsession, it's kind of the foundation of the whole freaking thing. And this is where Paul chimes in this beautiful, so in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes, and he quotes an authoritative tradition that was handed to him by the church fathers and mothers, right? By the earliest faithful followers of Jesus. This was the tradition he was handed. And we know it's a tradition because he brackets it off. He says, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you have received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel, by this message, you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you've believed in vain. All right, so that's how important this is. And then he says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Now, received and passed on were technical words that rabbis would use of the passing on of a tradition. Paul only uses them one other place, and it's in 1 Corinthians 11 when he talks about the Lord's Supper. And he quotes this tradition as authoritative. He does that here with the following creed, right? It's a very short creed that simply says, and he calls this of first importance. In other words, there is nothing more central to the Christian faith than this, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that on the third day he was raised according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, Peter, and then to the 12. And then he records some other appearances. And then he goes on to argue if the dead, and then obviously there were some in the Corinthian church who did not believe that in any sense of resurrection. So Paul begins by saying, hey, for if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those who have also fallen asleep or died in Christ, they're actually lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. In other words, to say that if someone found the body of Jesus in the tomb, would that mean that Christianity is a lie? And she says, no, faith is stronger than that. No, actually it's not. Actually, our faith is tied to that event, that thing. Now, again, you can argue, well, I don't think there's any evidence to believe it. That's great. That's great. Argue that. Or, I just think they had some sort of hallucination. And great. Argue that. I've heard all sorts of arguments against the, but what you can't say if you're saying you're operating within the Christian tradition is that the physical resurrection of Jesus just doesn't matter. You can't say that. There just isn't. And so this idea that somehow faith is stronger than that. No, this is something that in my view, is wobbly in the sense that if you could show that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, the whole thing crumbles. The whole thing crumbles, right? Then you're left with Judaism. In my case, all right, I would become Jewish,
yeah,
and convert to Judaism, because I still see something beautiful about the story of God and the story of Israel, but obviously Jesus wasn't Messiah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So anyway, I mean, I'm not. And this is so important, Tim. I don't want to dogpile on her. She's illustrating an important viewpoint that I think is wrong. But more than that, I'm exercising theological gatekeeping. And I'm doing that knowing that the question that's going to come next is, yeah, but you don't like theological gatekeepers, so how can you be one? And that's where I'm driving to. Make sense?
Yep.
All right. So we're still moving. We're half an hour in. Dang it. That's because of your phone.
We're good, man. We're cruising.
And the erection of Jesus, evidently. Good night. Oh, man. I hope I've never said that on a sermon on Easter Sunday. That would be awesome.
I'm sure you would have heard back.
Now, there's just a couple other things from this interview that I want to point out. He asks her about what about the other miracles of the New Testament, say the virgin birth. She says, I find the virgin birth a bizarre claim. It has nothing to do with Jesus' message. The virgin birth only becomes important if you have a theology in which sexuality is considered sinful. It also promotes the notion that the pure, untouched female body is the best body, and that idea has led to centuries of oppressing women. So things to think. First, is the virgin birth a bizarre claim? Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. And I think Christians forget how dumb this all sounds. I mean, how absolutely ridiculous this all sounds to somebody. You know, that yes, that God has made us. I mean, think about the story you have to tell. So God took dust and breathed into us, and then he took the side of the man and formed a woman. And then there was this talking snake and these two trees, and then God kicks them out with an angel with a flaming sword. And then they marry, evidently their relatives who we've never read about before, but are populating other parts of the earth. And then God gets pissed and says, screw it, I'm starting over. And then when he starts over, the first thing the dude he starts over with does is get naked and drunk and there's some weird sexual thing happening with one of his sons. And then he calls some old guy with his old wife, and he says, you're going to have a kid, but then it doesn't happen for years, and they keep trying, and they try to force God's hand, and, you know, then it happens, and then God says, hey, let's kill that kid, right? I just want to see if you'd love me that much, you know, that you would sacrifice this kid. And then there are all these promises about, you know, some awesome thing coming, and then there's this virgin girl impregnated by the Spirit, and Joseph has I mean, you're just like, this sounds
bizarre.
Oh my Lord. And so I'm on a campaign to keep Christianity weird.
Amen.
Right? Portland can be weird. Austin can be weird. But I think Christianity is weird too. And I think that Christians do a great disservice to people when we don't recognize how bizarre some of this stuff is. Now, whether or not we have good reasons to believe it is a separate issue. We just got to say, if you landed, you know, from somewhere else, and we were trying to explain this thing to you, it would be pretty interesting, right? But I do think the virgin birth is important, even if you, like I do, I don't think sexuality is sinful. I think there are some Catholic theologians who've argued that sexuality is sinful, and so Mary was a perpetual virgin, which is tough to square with the idea that Jesus had brothers and sisters. And no question, Christianity has been oppressive to women. No question. And whacked on sexuality. No question about that. But the way the virgin birth has played out in traditional Christian theology doesn't have anything to do with the female form being the best form. It's had to do with how sin was thought to be passed from one generation to the other. And that because there was no father involved in Jesus's birth, he could actually be called God's son, but because he was God's son, he could actually be called sinless. Original sin had not been transmitted to him in some understandings of certain theological systems. And so, and then you've got the idea that Jesus, that Jesus was fully divine as well as fully human. And the idea that there was both a human participant that carried Jesus to natural pregnancy, but there was the spark of the Holy Spirit. You know, there seems to be importance for who Jesus turns out to be, but you know, anyway, it is bizarre, no question. Okay. He says, what happens when we die? She says, I don't know. There may be something, there may be nothing. My faith is not tied to some divine promise about the afterlife. People who behave well in this life only to achieve an afterlife, that's a faith driven by a selfish motive. And I can understand that, right? If I only do good so I can go to heaven. She said, for me, living a life of love is driven by the simple fact that love is true. And I'm absolutely certain that when we die, there is not a group of designated bad people sent to burn in hell. That does not exist. But hell is a symbolic reality. When we reject love, we create hell, and hell is what we see around the world today in so many forms. Right? So that's, you know, we can get all into hell like we've done before. Now, one more fascinating bit, and then we'll move on. Christoph has asked this question of other people he's interviewed, and he says, for someone like myself who is drawn to Jesus' teaching but doesn't believe in the virgin birth or the physical resurrection, what am I? Am I a Christian? She says, well, you sound an awful lot like me, and I'm a Christian minister. And then she goes on to talk about how Christianity is at a real crossroads, similar to what it was like at the Reformation. She gives a little context, but her claim here obviously is, listen, you don't have to swallow the parts of Christianity, the orthodox historical, Christianity. You don't have to swallow those parts that you find untenable or ridiculous. You can kind of hold on to this generic idea of love, and that resurrection is a metaphor for love, conquering evil, and you can be a Christian minister. Now, my tweet that the world was anxiously waiting for, that God himself on Resurrection Sunday was like,
it's a timeout, everybody.
We need to call Erie in to kind of settle this one. The hubris, we're just, it's so ridiculous. But I couldn't help myself. And so I tweeted, of course you can choose not to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, no problem. Just don't pretend to be Christian in any meaningful sense of the word. Christians are precisely those who proclaim that Jesus is the risen Lord. So and what I mean by that, whether I said it well or not, is we are... well, hold on. Let me get to the response. All right. Then the response that I got from a friend was, hey, aren't you the same dude that snickered at those dogmatic Christians in podcast with Bonnie and Rob Bell? So which is dogmatic? Which is faithful? Who's the Pharisee? Who's the heretic? Where is the line? All right. Which is a phenomenal question.
Yeah.
Now, so here's what I want to say. What I want to say is, first of all, that if you begin to deny the central tenets of the Christian faith, then why would you call yourself Christian and not just something else? I mean, I get like being attracted to the teachings of Jesus, but when the teachings of Jesus include talking about some sort of hellfire and eschatological judgment and a conservative sexual ethic and the validation in some way, shape or form of the Old Testament, and right, I mean, why? To me, in my campaign to keep Christianity weird, I do think there is a place where you cease being a Christian even though you're a fan of Jesus. Right? I mean, because it seems like the central sort of thing, and this is what Paul's saying, it's of first importance. He was buried according to the scripture, he died according to our scriptures for our sins. He was buried and he rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. So Paul isn't saying these are actually isolated incidents. He's saying, no, this is actually fulfillment and completion and recapitulation of stuff that came much earlier in the story. And so I don't have any problem with somebody thinking this is a buttload of crap. I got it. I guess I have a problem with people who say that you can be a, quote, Christian and deny all of that stuff. And what I want to say is, well, let's contrast being boundary focused and being center focused. If you're new to the podcast, one of the most important podcasts we ever did was really early on. I don't even remember the number, and Tim's going to hate me because he gave me a list of topics. I don't remember.
I definitely gave you a list.
You definitely gave me a list, and I don't remember what it is, but let's not get hung up on that. But it was talking about, it's dealing with set theory, bounded sets versus centered sets. And it was hugely shaped my thinking on the church and about mission and all these sorts of things. And the idea is that what is it that separates groups from other groups? What separates insiders from outsiders in group settings, right? So you take a club soccer team and you say, well, what separates the club soccer team from the spectators? Well, lots of things, right? I mean, there's a physical delineation. There's the fact that The soccer players have tried out. They've been approved and accredited by the team. They've undergone, physicals and examination, and they receive paychecks. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to demarcate who's a spectator and who's a player when it comes to professional soccer, correct? So there's a boundary is the word that we use. There's a boundary. Physically, there's a boundary, but also procedurally and talent-wise, there are boundaries all over the place. Bounded sets are sets or groups that focus on maintaining and clarifying the boundaries between what separates the group from anyone else. And so every group will have boundaries, or else they're not a group. They're just some random, hodgepodge. But if they're a group, there are boundaries to that group. And the way, and this becomes very important, the way the boundaries are used is what distinguishes a boundary-focused group from a center set or center-focused group. And this is what I mean. The way in a boundary-focused organization that you delineate insiders and outsiders is that you have boundary markers. And the boundary markers can be anything. Let's just keep it close to Christianity. Do you affirm our statement of beliefs? Do you see the Bible as trustworthy? What's your view on LGBTQ, stuff? Do you believe the Bible's a literal 6-day creation, 6,000 years old? Or if you don't, then you don't believe the Bible. Or it can be practices. You have to be baptized 3 times underwater by an official representative, or your baptism doesn't count. Or, if you've got to be approved for membership before you can take communion, right? So these are all examples there are very clear boundaries, right? We know who's in and who's out. And if you want to be an insider, there's a list of things to do or believe or say that make you one of those. That can provide the reassurance of your group status because, I've crossed whatever boundary was placed in front of me. Centered set groups are different. And what defines a center set group or a center focused group isn't some adherence to boundary. Rather, it is the relationship of the individual members to the center. So in the Jesus example, where would you call people Christian? Well, it wouldn't be in what you say, like, hey, I'm a Christian, or what you sing, I sing Christian songs, or whether or not I was raised a Christian, or whether or not I've gone to church, or whether or not I've affirmed some ethereal creed, right? In the scriptures, in the teachings of Jesus, it's very clear, if you love me, you will obey my commands, right? There's a faith and allegiance part to Jesus that includes believing, but it's bigger than that. And so people can say, even Jesus critiques the religious leaders, hey, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. Or you will know true or false believers by their fruit. And so what Jesus is doing in his teaching is he's not talking about, here's the boundary markers. In fact, he was very, very intentional about violating some of the Jewish boundary markers that had grown up to become boundary markers that were not intended to be so. But rather what Jesus does is introduce kind of a centered set movement where the only thing that matters is your relationship to him, to the center, right? That's the big difference. What makes me a Jesus follower? It's not because I've done X, Y, or Z. It's because I'm moving towards Jesus. And if you map this out spatially, picture a big circle with an X in the middle. You could have people who are in close proximity to the middle who are moving away from Jesus. And you can have people who are in far proximity from the middle moving towards Jesus, right? So all that is to say, when you get into who's the faithful follower of Jesus, you're in pretty tricky ground. And so we naturally try to clarify by throwing up boundaries. However, and let me just give one final example, and I quote this all the time. I know it's boring, but John Ortberg, farming, cattle. There are a couple of ways to keep cattle in one location. First way, and I don't know that this is true, but it sounds really great in theory. First way is a boundary. You create a boundary. You build a fence. This is what keeps the cattle inside. And they're my cattle, and I know they're my cattle because they're inside the fence. A center-focused farm or ranch would, and this is Ortberg's example, would rather build the only well of fresh water in a certain place so that all of the cattle stay close, because that's the place where they get fresh water, right? So you can build a boundary, or you could build a center. I've always wanted to be a center-focused kind of person, and anything I'm involved with to be a center-focused sort of organization. And so when it comes to people who are focusing on the boundaries, I do get a little fussy and sometimes sarcastic and snickery. And because I do think there is a lot of Christianity expressed in its boundary marking forms that isn't of first importance, and nor is it necessarily biblical. I don't think it's biblical to demand that people give 10% to the church. I don't think it's biblical to demand that somebody pray and accept Jesus in their heart. And if they haven't done that, that they have to do that. I think there are all sorts of assumptions that we carry into Christian subculture, and we can talk about those another time. But sometimes those will become the boundary markers, right? Within the history of the church, there are people who have believed that God will ultimately save everybody. When I'm talking to Rob, and Rob's getting smashed for a book no one's read yet, and where he's hinting at universalism, okay, I don't agree. I don't think Jesus agrees. I think there's another view out there. But we're not just farewelling him because he crossed some imaginary boundary. So no question, guilty of snickering when it comes to elevating secondary issues and making them boundary markers so that people feel inside or outside, no question. However, the reason this gets me in a mode of, gatekeeping, I guess, is because there still has to be some center, some defined center. It's not, there's still a well. They're in the middle. In the cattle example, they're still playing soccer, right? There's to have a center. There is some definition to that center, or it turns out to just be nothing. And so, what I want to say is that boundary keeping, is not a great, fair, or loving expression of faith in the vast majority of instances. I do think, though, that when it comes to clarifying the center, I think work needs done there. And so when somebody says, listen, either we don't have the real words of Jesus, or they've been grossly distorted and misunderstood. But this Jesus didn't rise from the dead. This Jesus, never claimed to be born of a virgin, and I don't know that he did. But the stuff that we find weird, offensive, and odd, we just can kind of throw out. And I can be a generic fan of Jesus and call myself a Christian. That's where I want to go. I'm not so sure about that. I would throw in some stuff in the middle there that seems pretty central to the faith. Like Jesus was real, and Jesus really died, and Jesus rose from the dead, and that Jesus is Lord. I mean, that was the earliest confession of the earliest Christians. Simply, Jesus is Lord. And how do we know he's Lord? Is because he was vindicated through a bodily resurrection. Yeah. Otherwise Caesar is won. I mean, actually. So what I want to throw out, Tim, is in response to my friend saying, yeah, but aren't you the guy? Yeah, totally. And maybe I'm inconsistent, no question. But there does seem to be a place where the center does have to be defined. And for me, I mean, if someone said, hey, what's the center of the whole faith? I'm going to quote Paul, right? I mean, Jesus died, Jesus was buried, and Jesus rose again. And then he appeared. And I think there's more to it than that I would, I do think the Bible is unique and inspired in some ways. I think God is real, and I have independent reasons for believing in God. But if you start messing with that stuff, then just don't call yourself Christian. Just invent some other thing, because it kind of seems like that's what you're already doing,
Yeah, kind of. It almost, and you can tell me if I'm off basis here, but it kind of sounds like, saying you're a Marxist, or something like that, where you have found a philosophy that you appreciate, that you think has tenets that are pretty cool and might better the world, and then you take on that name just in like theory and philosophy, but not in this this bigger sense that we're talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, why give your allegiance to the Christian story if the Christian story is just another version of good wins over evil? Like, what's definitive about the Christian story that's not definitive of other stories? I mean, Endgame, dude, Endgame shows, right? No spoilers here, but
no spoilers.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's like I have great affection for some of the teachings of Buddhism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And about desire, and about, the frustration of desire, but I wouldn't call myself a Buddhist because I'm not committed to the whole program. And what I don't want to say is that Christianity is an all or nothing proposition when it comes to so much of the Bible, the divine violence or hell or whatever. But I do want to say there does come a point when you have to wrestle with the uniqueness of Jesus and the Christian witness to that uniqueness, and decide whether or not you buy that. And if you don't buy that, that's fine. That's fine. But I don't know that Christian's the best word for you at that point. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's what, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but if Christoph asks me, hey, am I a Christian? And I don't believe and again, who cares about what he believes or doesn't believe? But if you believe that beliefs work themselves out practically, hey, I don't believe in the virgin birth, I don't believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, am I a Christian? And I'd say, probably not. Why? Well, because the earliest Christians were those who claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Right? So if you're talking about Christian in like the modern American sort of, that sense, okay, fine. But if you're talking like the people that were martyred for their faith, or the people that were, risking everything to follow this Jesus, they weren't doing it because they didn't believe in the resurrection. They weren't doing it because they thought Jesus was just another instance of the grand story that love triumphs over evil. They were doing it because they believed that Jesus had really spoken to them and that he was risen in that sense. And so I do think, at some point, and then, of course, she gets a ton of hate, which is so idiotic for this. Oh, she said, she wrote a series of tweets, a couple of days later, and just said, someone sent me a picture of an ISIS beheading. This is why women shouldn't be ministers. Just horrendous. And so if you jettison historic Christianity because Christians are idiots, I can half understand that, She says, what was my crime to earn such condemnation? I don't believe exactly what other Christians believe. But the vitriol I receive for simply describing my beliefs reveals a deeper problem within Christianity, wherein soundness of doctrine is prized more than how we treat people. That's true. That's absolutely true. And according to Jesus, your theology isn't sound unless it results to love, right? And I don't mean the warm, fuzzy sort of modern sensibilities about love. I mean the rugged, truth-telling, like we're going to work this out sort of love that characterizes good marriages. That's what I mean when I talk about love, right? When Paul says, let's love working, or it's faith working itself out in love. So she's right that if we don't agree with someone's doctrine, then all bets are off. We can be total a-holes to that person in the name of Jesus, which is just as horrific, right? That's even the greater heresy. If we're going to start throwing that word around. But she says, she goes on to say, hey, listen, I would never want to convince anyone to believe otherwise. I have lots of friends who believe in the body resurrection, blah, 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 blah. She says, the only theology I say we must reject is that which causes harm to others. Bigoted theology that denigrates LGBTQIA plus people, patriarchal God talk, which oppresses women, faith that undergirds nationalism and war, beliefs that propagate white supremacy. Nothing I said in my interview harms others. They are simply reflections on my faith, how I relate and understand God, how I hear God calling me to live in love and grace, how I understand resurrection's deep power. So the question for me is it possible to self-identify my way into Christianity regardless of how much of it I believe? And there seems in the scriptures to be a no. And I know there's like the fundy in me is peeking out or whatever, but I there has to be a center, right? There has to be. And so
I mean, what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is this.
Yeah, exactly.
Is this?
It's with no center and not even doing the borders. You're just kind of, we're all just.
Well, no, she has borders.
Right.
Any theology that harms people.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right? Any theology that isn't love.
Yeah.
And so, that's its own sort of view these days. So I get that. But I kind of want to say, and man, I know this is so tricky. I say this with fear and trembling, but I'm an outward processor, so I'm just going to try it.
Keep it weird.
So she says, my statements didn't harm people. I don't know. She said, nothing I said in my interview harms others. And I'm like, part of me goes, I don't think that's true. Like, she didn't harm anybody unless she was mean-spirited or bigoted or whatever. I'm sure she's wonderful. But the idea that you get to come to Christianity and negotiate the terms of surrender, and that you can, if there are parts that offend our modern scientific sensibilities, you can hold on to kind of the general sweep and principles of the thing without, getting your hands dirty with some of the nuttier claims. I want to push back on that and say I do think that's harmful. It's when people disagree with Christianity and say, that it harms LGBTQ people, the sexual ethic it promotes is harmful. I find that much more honest than saying it doesn't promote the sexual ethic we always thought it did. Like, there's one scholar I really respect who was like, you know what? The Bible teaches homosexuality and sex outside of marriage is wrong, and the Bible itself is just wrong. There's so if she just wants to say, like, yeah, this is what the Bible teaches, but man, I don't buy it. That's fine. But that isn't what it is to be Christian, right? I mean, to be Christian is to hold on to the center, and part of the center is this person of Jesus, and part of the person of Jesus is that fully human, fully God. There's some sort of death that accomplished some sort of possibility of rescue and salvation, some sort of real burial that we don't know what happened during, but there was a real death, and then a real resurrection. And I understand that for hundreds of years, people have tried to divorce Christianity from those historical sort of things, and people will still continue to do that. And okay, I don't know that we can't say if she on the one hand is going to say, well, no, theology really does harm people, right? If it's God talk that hurts women, if it's God talk that hurts sexual minorities, then absolutely theology, harms. Then I want to open up the possibility that saying to people, hey, you can give your whole heart to this Jesus and not believe what the Bible says about him. I don't know that that's true. I just don't know that that's true, and part of me hates saying that because I want to grant everyone permission to be in process. But, at some point you're married or you're not. At some, you can date forever. I mean, but if you're dating someone 30 years, it's like, okay. and people do that, and that's whatever. But to say then that there's no point to the ceremony, there's no reality behind the covenant, I don't know. I just don't agree. I think there's something to it. And, I just don't. I don't want to call everything Christian. That if it's vaguely, and she doesn't either. That's the thing, right? I mean, she doesn't want to acknowledge the child abuse story that is so often passes as gospel. That's Christian, and she doesn't want to say that the way we understand some of the teachings of Paul in a manner that harms women, that's Christian, and obviously, so she's doing the same thing. I just want to locate it differently. Her center is love, and love defined in a very accepting, inclusive sense. The problem with Jesus is that he's exclusive too, and you can't, and I hate it, but you can't just get around those statements where he's like, listen, guys, if you don't hate your mother and father, and many will say to me, Lord, Lord, and I will say I never knew you. I mean, what's he doing there? It's like you can't just say, oh, yeah, but he's so warm and fuzzy and he loves everybody. Well, that's true. But he rebuked the religious people, even though he loved them, right? He called sinners to repentance. I mean, at some point you just lose Jesus. And if you've lost Jesus, you lose Christianity. It's end of story, right? Because I don't want to make a big separation between faith in Jesus and faith in Christianity. And she does. And I just want to say, I don't think you can do it. I don't think you can do it. If I can't trust that the gospel writers told the truth about Jesus, then why would I trust anything about Jesus?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think this is a very interesting conversation that's going forward, it needs to stay, because I had this conversation today with somebody who's struggling, and there's been this has been a conversation on this podcast, how to read the Bible, how the Bible breaks down into the way, what kinds of literature each section is, and how you should approach that, and how you should interpret that. And I think there's a lot of people who are wrestling with the idea of if one of these things isn't true, or if we interpreted it incorrectly, or any of these kind of things, then they're just they're going into a free fall. Yep. And they're trying to hear Jesus through that, and in some ways, I think that's how this is a dangerous statement, because she's throwing out some huge tenets of faith.
Absolutely.
So I think that, there's so many people that are listening to this that are struggling with, just what is truth, and what is God trying to say, and how do I reconcile these new things, these new theories, all this kind of stuff. And
yes,
yeah,
buddy, I do. And that's why I'm so I believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But that's why I want to be so careful, man, when people are reconstructing that you can still be moving towards Jesus, not have all this lined up. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's big.
Well, I think it's huge. It's just that when Christian ministers are saying, hey, you don't have to believe some of the central tenets of Christianity to be a Christian, then I kind of get fussy.
Yeah.
And but if you're listening and you're like, dude, I don't buy it, but I find some of Jesus compelling, that perfect. That's awesome. That's why we do this.
Keep asking.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm not going to pretend that there aren't, at the end of the day, some things that if you never nail them down, it's okay. But if you're going to go into the world as a follower of Jesus, I don't know how much we get to pick and choose on the thing, and I think we've misunderstood a lot, no question. I even there was a great headline in USA Today, which I don't read the paper, but I follow their Twitter feed. So here's the line. Churches will continue hemorrhaging members until we face the truth. Being a faithful Christian does not mean accepting everything the Bible teaches.
Wow, that was today?
Yeah. Isn't that it? Isn't that it? And I mean, that's what your friend's saying. I mean, that's what this person's saying. Like, God, and I know what they mean. In this instance, is about LGBTQ people, and so I have no doubt, and I'm an advocate of rereading in light of things that we're learning about human life and the world and whatever, going back to those ancient texts and saying, okay, let's wrestle with this. I just don't think that if we reject Christianity, great. You know, if somebody chooses to reject it, okay. I mean, that's if you've considered it and you're just like, I can't buy it, that's fine. I just want to make sure it's the right Christianity they're rejecting.
For sure.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's where I'm like, I don't. It wasn't a watered down love conquers evil faith that exploded in the first century. It was, hey, you're going to lose your job. You have to flee your home. You might be martyred in the arena, right? What, you know, I mean, and even today, people aren't being persecuted for an idea. They're not being persecuted for some abstract conception. They're being persecuted because they believe they have this Jesus thing in a way that transcends his physical life, death, and in a way that we call resurrection, that Jesus is still alive and active in the world today and calling and moving and doing all of those sorts of things. And that's where I'm like, there has to be some place where you say, let's just call it something else then. Because if somebody reads this article and says, oh, that's what being a Christian is, and they accept it or reject it, I would argue they haven't really accepted or rejected Christianity. In the same way that if they hear just the nasty God hates you, you're still in your sin, God is awful, and he takes it out on Jesus, they haven't heard real Christianity either. So on both sides of the conservative and the kind of the progressive theological spectrums, like, I think it's very similar error. And then the question, of course, becomes, well, how do you know your Christianity is any different and not just another version of the other Christianities? And then we're into some really interesting stuff, baby. Woo! Dang. But you know what? This I want to do, and I don't, being a faithful Christian does not mean accepting everything the Bible teaches. Now, if what that means is, hey, we've learned that what we thought the Bible teaches isn't what the Bible actually teaches, I'm in.
Yeah.
All in. And I'm in if it means, hey, the Bible doesn't address some of what we're dealing with now, and we've got to just kind of make it up as faithful people led by the Spirit and immersed in the Scriptures. Okay, I'm up for that. The Bible doesn't deal with in vitro, and the Bible doesn't deal with, massive, massive issues that we're wrestling with in our culture. But if it means that that I get to, on the basis of whatever, pick and choose between some of the central stuff that's formed 2,000 years of tradition, well, then I get a little fussy. Although I would argue that list is very, very small, right? It's not as big as, so I would totally disagree with the boundary people who are like, you got to believe this about creation and believe this about, predestination, and this about whether you can lose salvation, or this about the inerrant Bible, and da-da-da-da-da. I mean, that drives me crazy. But I don't know, there's still a center, and I think the center has to be defined and clarified. So anyway, holy crap, dude. I would imagine, I would love to hear from our audience, either on our Facebook page, which is Vox Podcast with Mike Geary. Just like that page and you can participate. Or in some other context, hello@voxpodcast.com or whatever. Where do you think gatekeeping is important? Like, when is it important? Now we haven't talked about how gatekeeping should be done, right? Because it should be done in love. It should be done with a heart in the Bible's words toward correction. And again, that doesn't mean I'm right, you're wrong. That means rather we're going to work together to submit ourselves to the text to see what it really says. it should be done in a context that's safe, and I'm the biggest sinner in the room, and all of that sort of stuff. But if we've got a Christianity where nothing is essential to it, then we don't have Christianity. We've just got something else. And I do think there's some more essentials, if you're going to give your allegiance to Jesus. So anyway, and again, my outward processor. And it's interesting, the people that were responding to Jesus, how many of these essentials did they have? I mean, they didn't know resurrection was coming. Yeah. They didn't know God was the second person of the Trinity, or that Jesus was the second person. I mean, right? So, even the thief on the cross who just says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Well, okay. He's moving towards Jesus. He's in. So even the centered set thing gets fuzzy. I totally get that. Anyway. All right, I'm done. I'm in trouble. It's over. Don't edit.
But please do. Yeah, I'm not gonna edit anything. Please, all you folks out there, do chime in on Facebook. There's some good conversations happening on there, and Mike's on Instagram.
Oh boy.
Which there's also conversations happening on there. And that's just Vox Podcast on Instagram.
Yeah. I'm just a big deal.
Mike is the king of
freaking deal.
Social media and of the internet.
I'm just blessed for you, my friend. I'm so conflicted by all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's like I want people to find the podcast, or, I think we're doing good stuff, but just the world of self-promotion these days is so toxic.
It's gross.
It
but
is gross.
We can use, these are great tools for, what did we have on the, we had folks from Scotland and a couple from Africa and a few other far, corners that are far away from Ohio who are piping in conversation with each other. So if anything, hopefully these platforms can be great little communities to have conversations and to wrestle with this stuff. And so come and wrestle with us, please.
Yeah. So anyway, my friends, wow. That's all I got. I just put a Tic Tac in my mouth.
That says game over. That's the end game right there.
Yes, we're in the end game. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you. And in these days, may he give you peace. And my brothers and sisters, thanks for the deep, deep honor of participating a little bit in your journey. And I do always hope and pray that it's helpful. So until next time, my friends, thanks.